You subverted our will. Return to man what man should never have been given in the first place. Why? Alicia's fire veins burned bright with conviction as she looked up at the throne of the god of flame. He rarely interacted personally. It was a considerable effort to maintain the flow of fire across the mortal realms and the holy both. If he did not, the whole of either could catch a flame. So he had trusted servants to aid him in controlling his domain, ensuring its health, as all deities did. Yet, she had betrayed his most important commandment, one the gods who so often squabbled, had personally come together to agree upon and enforce, and he wanted to know why. So she told him. She went so far even as to recreate the scene. Dancing colors wreathed in heat sprung to life within the unburning, immaculate halls of the Lord of Fire. The Lord himself understood her intent. So, he simply leaned forward and peered into the silhouettes outlined by her perfect manipulations of her element. She stood on a lonely shore by a quiet sea, seabirds chiming their cries through the air all around. It was winter, which she reflected by giving the scene a blue-white hue and micking snow with crackling pale sparks that gently fell to the floor and ceased to be overlaying the landscape. Behind her, and a female human, was a mountain range gently, huddling against the sea. The human sat by an unlit fire. The mountain held caves, its foothills crowned by villages overlooking the coastline. There were mines somewhere along their tall bodies, small roads leading to the caverns that held the most useful ores and other riches. There was supposed to be a firekeeper there. One of her kind, who allowed man to use the Lord of Fire's power, had trained pupils in the way of priest magic. She had opened the invisible flow of divine power to the things man would normally use to make torches, resting and cooking fires, and other useful things they needed to survive. They had left, simply left, and, for whatever reason, they had taken the power with them and cut off the flow. The villages were cold and empty now. The animals, too, had frozen and withered. The only things that still lived in the mountain did not need fire, or would not live for much longer. Everything else had risked the journey to warmer lands, or already died. Many, likely, had not completed their travels. "Where did your flame, tender, go, mortal?" She sat down next to the human. She held a bundle in her arms. It was unmoving and marked by frost. She rocked it gently, occasionally, until it hurt too much to pretend. "I don't know." She spoke a coaster tongue. Alicia knew every language, so she understood her. "But it no longer matters. Do you know why she left?" The human was quiet. She loved someone who fell in love with someone else. Alicia did not understand. She left her duty over heartbreak? She left us. She took the magic and all the fires went out. The meat went cold. The dogs froze. We knew it was going to be the hardest winter yet, but she left us. Tears trailed down the human's cheeks. She rocked the bundle, stopped. "I thought you were supposed to give us miracles, not take them. I was supposed to learn to work the powers myself, but I couldn't do anything. I had to watch. The blessing was gone." "I am sorry." The human turned to her. Alicia thought that if she had the energy left, the human would have shouted at her, or at least frowned. She was too tired to do either. Her body was withered. Alicia could see her ribs under winter cloak. The clothes she wore were layered, furred, and thick, but they had not been enough. She had torn patches from it to give to the thing she held, and that also had not been enough. I'd been faithful. She'd even called me friend. Why were we punished? Does the Lord in Red hate us? Her voice choked. He does not. Then why? He needs us to be his hands, to look in the places he cannot, and fix the things he has no time to punish those who are truly wicked, and aid those who are not. The Lord of Fire finally changed expression, briefly, shifted his great tapering robes. They were made of solidified fire, cascading from the lowest heat to the hottest in color. He was a master of his domain, in the truest sense, and he could hear her thoughts, even the ones from the past. Alicia did not say anything to the human. She simply considered what she had seen. The lifeless landscape she had walked to find the villages with soulless streets and rotting bodies. She had seen humans gathering old corpses into a pyre, desperately trying to work the tinder with flint and steel. Not a single spark came to be. She gave the woman fire. The Lord of Fire watched her do it, and he frowned gravely. Alshanut did not just grant the human power over flame, but committed the ultimate sin, defied her Lord's will by allowing her the power to spread it to others. It was not a thing the Lord of Flame had prevented them from being able to do. It was assumed that all his servants that he trusted so deeply would act in the way that was best, and that they would undo any acts that caused undue harm. This act could not be undone. And it could not bring back all of the living things that had starved, frozen, and died, some with hope in their hearts, crossing a dreary land that had only been livable because of the gifts the gods allowed them, only to die huddled together in a dark, frozen place. Alesha had seen some of them, though many she likely missed, buried by the winter winds and the snow they brought. The memory ended. The only fire lighting the room now was the flames licking off of Alesha and her lord's body, both burned dimly. Alesha's with resignation to her fate, her lord's with gravity and judgment. The Lord of Fire adopted a thoughtful expression. What happened after this? I do not know. Alesha answered simply. She had not been allowed to watch the consequences of her actions unfold for long. She had been called to the holy courts before she could do so. Then let us find out. The hall was suddenly afire, but no mortal would be able to tell. The world shifted around Alsha, heat being perfectly controlled and parsed, divided, and remolded into a recreation of the mortal world that would only burn those within it if the god of flame chose so. Alesha stood in the center of a human village, every texture and color perfectly recreated in a way she could never match. She saw the woman from before. Someone had fed her. There was something else in the bundle now, though it was healthy and full of life. Torches were lit all around, and men, women, and children danced arm in arm in tune to someone playing a North Coaster instrument. The woman was smiling. The village was thriving. A once dim land was now awash with brightness, an act of human hands done without outside intervention. The gods had taken fire from man for all the things they'd done with it that they had not been meant to. Killings that should never be performed in such a way as they had been. Entire communities ended in screams and smoke. Yet, here, in this village, this is the present, not the past or the future. The Lord of Fire spoke quietly. His robes swirled around him as he stood up. He towered well over Alesha, but he seemed almost small somehow, wandering through a village that he was not part of. He examined the scene in all its detail, watched silently until he was content. He moved a hand through the flames, letting his mundane limb brush away parts of it. My lord, Alesha let her voice gently fill the silence. I believe we have made a mistake. The Lord of Fire continued before Alesha could stop recoiling from startlement. We thought that taking away this thing... He conjured fire into his hand, swirling in all its possible lights. He snuffed it out. Would prevent suffering. I think that, for what trust I have violated, I must make amends. What do you intend to do, my lord? Return what we stole. Alesha stood stunned. She took pains to remember herself. The other lords... They will not like it, yes, and be ill-convinced. They do not see what I see. The god of fire paused. He looked down at Alesha. Suddenly he shrunk, standing shoulder to shoulder with her in height. He looked her in the eye. What you saw. What I should have seen. He created a new scene, one where they both stood in the clouds over a vast set of seas, continents, and landscapes, countries, cities, towns, villages, people, animals, all the mortal things the gods had a duty to tend. It will take most of my attention to keep the others from interfering. Alesha, child of fire and dutiful attendant, will you be my hand in the mortal realm once again? Alesha was silent, for a time. Then she nodded. It would not bring back what had been lost, but it would allow new things to grow. The gods had assumed fire to be a weapon, a misused tool they had meant only to be used to create life and to wither away that which caused rot. Somewhere along the way, they had forgotten that original motive, lost trust in the very beings that they had given such a sacred gift to, and lost sight of why they had done it. It was time to remind them. Enjoy next amazing story. Nobody'd told her that women hadn't worked the factories until the war started. Fury 87 remembered the factories. She remembered the smell of gunpowder, the cries of women at work, and the sounds of screws being drilled into place. Day and night. She'd watched shells, bombs, and cartridges be filled with death waiting to be let loose, each one sent out to be carried across the sea to a battlefield she thought she'd never see. That was before. By now, those battlefields had long stopped being imaginary. If the war hadn't turned the way it did, she would still be back there, filling in gaps in the workload as any good automaton was meant to. She was still useful out here, though. They'd given her a flamethrower, a powerful gun that could immobilize a tank by itself, and a sturdy outer shell to keep her moving even against the best the enemy could bring. All she had to do was hit her quota. Enough years would pass by, eventually, enough people would die. When they were all out of munitions, they'd stop fighting. She'd trade in her rusting armor for a nice dress, go back to the factory and settle down. She couldn't have children. But there were plenty of other things she could do to prove she was human. A woman. She just needed to earn the chance. She wondered what they did when they weren't at the factory. The other workers. She'd heard of other jobs, had seen pictures of other buildings, places where you rested between work hours. That sounded nice. Mother hold me, the bad men are a-comin', and I don't know which is which. Fury 87 heard clapping. All around her, people began to thump their feet and make noise. There were women too now, not just men, as of the last dozen or so deployments. They'd stopped having enough men to fill the landing craft regularly, so the open seats had needed filling. All of them were starting to sing. They did it to calm their nerves. Fury 87 had not been allowed to join in at first, but the men had softened up to her. The women too, after the first few missions. The women looked at her strangely, though, as of late. They whispered when she spoke to Henriette. Fury 87 heard one say once in a hush that women aren't supposed to talk the way she did with Henriette. But I know that I must go, or I'll never learn to tell them part. Fury 87 liked Henriette best because, no matter how wrong Fury 87 spoke or acted, Henriette looked at her like she was just another person. It's taken years for the others to start looking at her like that. And the new recruits, the older soldiers called them fresh off the press, always started out regarding her with sour expressions. The term had never made sense to Fury 87. None of the flesh folk, as she privately called them, came from factory lines. Mother hold me, I don't want to come back and see you gone. Will you cry for me if a letter returns without me? She had noticed that when people died, soldiers tended to do one of two things. They mourned, and they did it loudly even when no one thought anyone was watching. Or they stuffed the pain away inside them, sealed it up with screws, and sent it away somewhere else. Maybe flesh folk only started to see machines as people when enough of them died. A lot of them wore scrap around their necks with their dog tags now. You can't replace a son or daughter no matter how many come and go. It made sense. They could always build a new Fury to replace her and the rest of the automatons. You had to watch enough things go off the line and not come back to start missing them. At the factory, they'd called her silly for thinking like that. But when they'd started building a lot more things like her, they'd said it less and less. There were more verses, but the song was over, since the sounds of shells exploding around them became too loud to even scream through. They'd let her lead the song this time. Her voice was staticky and fuzzy like a radio someone had hit too much, but some of them were crying anyway. Though she didn't think it was because her singing had improved at all. She went out first. She would have even if it wasn't what she was supposed to do. They needed to go home too. She emerged, splashing salt water onto a beach. Navy vessels and small watercraft surrounded her on her left and right behind her. Up ahead were scores. of trenches on a series of high and low hills with an important city called Versailles in the distance. A mountain of enemies stood between her and that critical strategic point. Behind its walls, more foes, civilians, factories. Has she ever been a civilian? No. Even before they'd sent her out, she'd been another tool at the factory. She needed to earn that right first. Infantry advanced behind her. Caleb, Conrad, Hethiel, Daozun, Henriette. Henriette was the name she clung to hardest. It was the one she needed to protect the most, though she'd die for any of them. That wasn't just her purpose anymore. It was something that just seemed right now. She mowed down the hedgehogs, a great blade taking the place of her hand where the cannon was mounted on her right limb. She cleared the way for the amphibious tanks to emerge from the larger ships. They were very important to this particular operation. Like her, they'd been designed for a very specific purpose. Factory, battlefield, Henriette. With her flamethrower mounted on her left limb, she burned through enemy combatants. She couldn't smell their charring flesh, but they all screamed the same. A tank started coming over the hill. They'd begun sending those out earlier as the Hexans had built more and more Furies. She was designed to be nothing, if not effective. She could deliver shells as well as she'd built and carried them to transport trucks and planes. So that's what she did. The hostile vehicle only let loose one shot before it burst open. The enemy had not known about the improved armor-piercing rounds. She wondered if the infiltrator automatons had homes they wanted to go back to as well. She hoped someone in the tank had survived somehow. Though her firearms had not been made for mercy, they'd been made to replicate artillery in a highly mobilized fashion. Caleb and Conrad were gone. Fury 87 had noted the trajectory of the shell. She kept moving. She had to. Steam ran off her back as her lumbering metal frame stomped through the mud and sand. She focused through the noises, gunfire, explosions, yelling. She could not look behind her. But she had taught herself to pick out the voices of whoever was underfoot. She wanted to know when they were about to die, even if it was because of her. She'd seen treads run over unlucky comrades before, the well and the injured both. And it had not just been on the enemy's side. Anything she had to cut through moved past her, or had already been cleaved in two. She dismounted her blade, letting it fall loose into the sand with a thud and a spray of wet grain, revealing a chain gun. If she were allowed to, she'd close her eyes. But she couldn't. She counted every downed combatant. She sent 37 letters out to widows and mourning mothers before she was intercepted. The Furies of the Cochins were a bit bigger than her, but they were slower, easier to pin down, easier to break. It was extra weight from inefficiency and half-knowledgeable mimicry, not strength. They did not have proper torsos either, and had not bothered to hide the cockpits with more than a greasy window with almost bullet holes riddling it. Behind that thin veil, Fury 87 saw something that looked a lot like her and almost human. Bulkier, though. Almost ugly. Almost. They shouted something at her through a radio speaker that she could not understand. She had something similar, but she'd found it to be mostly useless once everyone's ears started ringing. They sluggishly barreled towards, her obviously mechanical movements taking one foot past the other until they reached her. It carried something resembling a shotgun, a massive shrapnel launcher built to kill men and machines both. She traded blows with it. There was nothing elegant about it. Early models had engaged each other in melee often. All this had done is reduce efficiency, leaving two important units entangled with each other and preventing defenders from pushing back important enemies and attackers from slaughtering their way into fortifications. So she unleashed a simple flurry of bullets, rapidly depleting her chain gun as her chest area took a spray of oversized projectiles. She had seen an amphibious tank crawling its way somewhere along her left and had hoped it would see the engagement before she had to lose much armor. At the same time, most of her frontal plate was torn to shreds, leaving her exposed and vulnerable inside the cockpit. A shell impacted the side of the enemy Fury, tearing it in two. Its legs buckled under it, and its cockpit spilled steaming water, oil, and mechanical entrails. Huntelli. The radio crackled out these two words. The automaton inside looked like they might have once worked bridges, perhaps done the same job she had. It was smaller than her original vessel, but it could have done the job just as easily. Is that a name? She felt compelled to ask, though her voice didn't reach it. It looked at her, maybe went to say something, but all that came out was oil. It closed its eyes. I'm sorry. I wish you could have gone home to them. If that was someone important, they loved you. Even if you weren't sure, Battle madness was overtaking her. She wasn't supposed to feel fear or panic, but they'd wanted something that could think, that could. Fury 87 heard Hethel cry out. She briefly turned her head, allowing the bare swivel it could perform. It wasn't close to a full turn, but it let her see Hethel searching for a part of her she was, never meant to lose wander briefly about before getting cut down in a hail of bullets. I know I don't want to go, but who else can they ask to fight? Daozun began shout-singing at her side, huddling close enough to her leg to interfere with her ability to move forward. Henrietta said something to him, but Fury 87 couldn't make out what over a shell that landed near them. Not the church's men, not the souls with unearned medals. Another tank swiveled its barrel their way. Fury 87 calculated something, followed its aim, and made a choice. Her chest was already exposed. Did she really have to go so quickly? Could they rebuild her? It was so sudden. I fight for the men building ships at home. I fight for the sons and daughters wishing me good luck. I fight for the... Fury 87 suddenly buckled, letting her body be a shield. She didn't know if they'd make it in spite of her decision, but she hoped they would. And she hoped she'd wake up in a factory, with a story to tell and a dress waiting for her back home. She always thought she'd look good in poppy red. Took you long enough. Henriette watched the news on one of the world's first colored televisions. The colors were saturated, dull, but had just enough life in them to make it worth it. She could have said the same thing about someone who'd been worth a hell of a lot more than this newfangled box. But they were always building new things to replace the outdated ones. It didn't matter if the old thing was just as good. Someone always wanted a brighter shine. She held a framed photo in her hand. It had a small crack in it, but it hadn't done a thing to take the luster out of Fury 87's frame. They'd made her look human, given her a face, eyes, the whole deal, all molded to a silver-bronze frame. She'd been a bit too tall, but that was fine. She'd been gentle, and she'd made sure she remembered everyone else's names, even if some of them were held a little closer to her mechanical heart. When it had been beating, it hadn't beat any differently. The government had kept its promises, given out the medals, the certificates, the licenses, and I'm proud to announce, to honor a battle you didn't fight in. That in light of irrefutable proof that all who fight for this country can be honorable just whether they breathe steam or air. They'd been around long before the wars. That today on August 8th, 1342, all automatons demonstrating sufficient intelligence with a federal office dedicated to ensuring no neglect is tolerated are to be granted equal rights, liberties, and citizenship across every territory of the Hexan Republic and the new Cochin territories. There was a roar of applause from the crowd on screen. But Henrietta's life had rided on, paying attention to small details. So had her relationship with the only woman she'd never loved. So she saw the dismissiveness in the shoulders of some. There weren't as many of them as there were eager celebrants tossing hats and getting ready to crack upon booze and wine bottles or children twirling little flags, but they were there. You should be sitting here with me, watching this. She didn't cry often. She tried to push the pain down as far as it could go. She would have, if there hadn't been that knock at the door. She slammed a hand against the table next to her, startling her cat. It hissed and ran away as Henrietta stood up. She was wearing a poppy red dress, but it hadn't been for the sake of looking presentable. She hadn't been able to stomach the idea of showing up in person. She didn't want any of their damn medals or awards. She should have been happy. By all rights, it should have been the best news she'd heard in years. But she stood still. As she pulled open the door, she had to take a moment, but she managed to get it all the way open. Standing right there was a foreign automaton, one she swore she'd seen go down in flames and bullets on that battlefield. They hadn't even won the fight in the end. That had been 3 waves and thousands of dead, hundreds more taken as POWs after. None of my comrades had ever heard my voice. My superiors wanted my mind and body, not my soul. I didn't know what those 4 words meant till later, but they meant the world to me. Its voice was mechanical and stiff, yet it was hard to miss its feelings in the static. Who are... Henriette went silent. It offered her a stack of letters. She opened and read the first one. It was not signed or stamped on the outside. Dear Henriette, I saw the others writing these, but I didn't have anyone to send them to. And I did not have a place to store them. They did not give me a bunk, a bag, or a chest, so I kept them in the armor. I have no right to ask. I do not think, even when I go home and they give me my papers, that the dresses will fit, or that I will know how to do the other jobs women do. When I first saw you on the factory lines, I do not think you saw me. Really saw me. Not at first. And I think you forgot who I was later, once they'd shut me up inside that bigger machine. But you learned to see me the first time. And you did. It again later without me having to give you my name again. I think that is when I fell in love with you, and I think I did it twice. I know we are not meant to be together for many reasons. But if we go home together, will you teach me all the things the others didn't? Will you hold my hand and say the special words? I want to give you flowers and chocolates and do all the other things women do. If you go home alone, wear me around your neck. If I leave you a widow, I'm sorry. I hope you can forgive me. But you can always find a new automaton. I know what you're thinking, reading that, but don't worry. You taught me I'm not replaceable. So I won't go anywhere if it's not on my own terms. I love you. Learning that from you was the easiest thing I'd ever had to figure out. Fury 87. The tears came freely. It was hard, both sobbing so openly and looking through the rest. Fury 87 had kept letters for every battle, written a eulogy for every soldier she'd seen die who she'd known the name of. It was a wonder nobody had ever wondered where all the extra parchment had gone, but she had always written so finely. She could fit a lot of thoughts into one page for a woman with hands so large. Why did you bring me this now? Now, of all days? Henriette wiped her face with the back of her hand. I appreciate it, I truly do, but that wasn't all. We recycled and rewelded what we could take from the battlefield. I have not been one machine for years, but the corpses of several sewn together. The Kochon machine hesitated, perhaps out of shame. But when they took me from the beach, I kept something. I should not have. If they had ever found it, it would have been almost treason. Yet, he produced something red and cracked. It looked like a bullet had impacted it, but it had remained whole despite everything that had been done to it. Henriette gripped the dangling piece of scrap around her neck. She still wore her dog tag, not as a medal, but for the sentiment of having them close together. She looked down and made a connection. The shard was red. Humans and automatons both had hearts. And you could always replace a machine. Hope this one reads well. My brain broke. I was evolved, created, to be able to fully comprehend the weight of large numbers. Tens, hundreds, thousands, millions. I have always seen the whole, sectioned into what is and is not of value. This was intended to allow me to parse without question that which held less weight and contributed insufficiently compared to the larger volume. Your species cannot do this. You can only see handfuls, but you also see individuals. I am Grex. This is the name of my people. We have actively culled, curated, and suppressed lives in the count of trillions over the course of our 2 millennium of existence. This means little to you. I counted and perceived every singular within that sum. Yet I committed genocide. I oppressed, butchered, separated, and repurposed. Entire cultures and histories were erased by my hands and the hands of those who call me kin. I can see every part of our sum also. This does not bring me a sense of solidarity so much as reinforce the weight of the sins committed and the scale of the mechanisms involved. I came upon your vessel during the early days of your venture into greater civilization. I witnessed your first spacefaring vessels and found them paltry and almost pitiable. I captured, with less than minimal effort, one of your ships. I performed an interrogation. I did this with each and every craft I seized. I learned much of your people, more than you ever wanted me to know. You feared I would use what I learned to destroy you. Instead, we deemed you little more than a curiosity to monitor using excess resources. You viewed us as an enemy. You attempted to assail us when we came close. You failed. I noted that this brought your species into a state of unease, that this caused you to become violent and distrustful towards those you encountered. I devoted some semblance of proper attention to your kind when I saw that your behavior, despite initial assumption, varied deeply on an individual basis. You squabbled madly over ethics and morals. We were always at the edge of your vision, a threat you thought was omnipresent until a generation passed. You forgot. You lacked any sort of inherent empathic capabilities. You lacked cohesion. You barely understood that the whole was a concept that should be considered, despite your assumption of culture, faith, politics, and government. I had seen these things before. They were rare in a sense, but I had witnessed these patterns. You reached out to us eventually. You had branded us your opponents in space, skirmished, forgotten, then reached out in such a fashion that we questioned if your record-keeping was truly as extensive as we believed it to be. We offered to bring you into our fold. You denied us, so we resumed lack of interest in your affairs. I watched you. You grew. You brought others into your own tribes like animals seeking symbiosis. Traded. Bonded. We made sufficient plans to act upon should you pose a legitimate threat when we determined you, or the species you aided so brazenly, were incapable of appreciation and worthy only of loathing and eradication or redirection. It was after your great war, after you exhausted so many of your resources, burned your souls out in such quantities that, had I been capable of feeling disgust or sorrow for your kind at the time, I would likely have expressed it in excess. Yet, while those around you were forced to repair themselves in body and mind, to such a degree we collectively agreed the opportunity was not worth discarding, you continued to shoulder the burdens of your allies in spite of pains. I captured a full fleet's worth of your vessels. I interrogated each individual harvested, molded your miserable weapons, shields, and vehicles into my own, and took solace in the fact such a floundering people would no longer plague creation. One of you stood against me. You knew there were no odds worth taking, that no pleading would service you, that the best you could hope was for assimilation into something greater. So you told me stories, ones I had not heard, ones that were more isolated in their impact, ones that were similar to the previous, yet affected greater scopes. You told me of dictators, philosophers, messiahs, and orchestrators of mass death. Had heard of these things before from other civilizations, from your own. But you expressed them differently now. I now believe, perhaps, that when the human named Morgan stepped forward to speak with me, he was simply tired. Exhausted by conflict to such a degree, he reached out without passion, only a faint glimmer of hope. Morgan Terrence spoke to me of a sibling who he had supported through birth despite being despised. Then, I thought justly, by the universe to such a degree they barely were allowed to live within it. Sights, sounds, sensations, and comprehension were all difficult. He had brought them to the brink of full personhood, to something vaguely assorted into a contributing unit. Morgan had fought tooth and nail for his brother, as was the expression he used. However, in spite of this, war came and reset the progress made to such a point there was no logical reason to attempt recovery. He asked me to spare this brother of his, this kin. He took my hand, said that the Braille had been as we had, not understanding we had purpose and not desperation. He offered me compassion. I killed his crew in front of him, dismissing all that was said and merely noting it for review by peers, who could utilize the information in our conquests and adaptation. I was of high rank. I had proven myself. My kin were those who stood worthy beside me as equals. Much of what I knew of humanity, of many species, was worthy only of loathing. You separated those who were worthy and suppressed their evolution, while you paved the way for those who could stand only with weakness and cowardice, not strength. You reminded me of the cog, the long enemies of our people who sought to bring these weaknesses to the forefront. I pondered. Why was it that humanity was like the cog, yet also as Grecs, yet their structures were so pointless and meandering? Where was their sense of order, their sense of ambition? I killed Morgan last. I did not relish it. I simply wished to observe. I saw the hope die in his eyes. I did not understand I had been affected by your valiance until I was too late to act upon it. You do not know, nor will you remember, the species we deprived of a chance at life that I will mention next. We called them the outcaws, or frail plants. They lived in the serenity. The species there were often of little interest beyond studying, the development of thought and the draw towards the divine. I believe perhaps observing it was our deity's way of reminding us other gods were not strong. I had no reason to do so, but I stepped onto the planet's surface. We had removed most of the species from the planet for study, harvest, and repurposing. Their fate was experimentation, and eventually to become waste-crushed underfoot by a war machine they barely comprehended. They had a species they shared, their world with, some sort of insectile symbiote that served a purpose we did not come to understand in a way that was significant to us. A member of the Ayut cause, ignorant of the extremity of their circumstance, approached me in such an unthreatening, in any sense, manner that I simply allowed it. Their world was being uprooted and burned around them, their people dying or condemned. Yet it did not attack me. It attempted to communicate. It reached out to me and found I could not understand. So it tried to show me speech in a different way. I allowed it. I was overtaken by an impulse that I no longer believed to have been a sign of defect, but the opposite. It showed me the beating heart of its planet. I felt and understood every root, every connected soul. It showed me ones it had ignored, something I thought perplexing, to allow to find their own path. It showed me that the insectile creatures had come to them. It showed me a history of quiet progress towards placidness and a senseless lack of greater desires. Every question I asked, it answered surely but slothfully. One day we will reach the stars, but it will not be today. One day we will speak to those who call to us from the beyond, but it will not be today. First, it said, we must plant roots. First, we must achieve individuality within a whole, and we must learn to love in the ways that matter without losing self. It showed me a God who had allowed it, but not guided it. No more than gentle nudges, minor healings. I looked towards the nebula of empathic energy that lay just beyond the veil of the world's green-blue atmosphere. The world's clouds trailed some strange mist of vapor. It had been deemed harmless, so we did not look into it further. In that moment, it was beautiful to me, and I did not understand why. When I killed the creature, its longtime companion, a being of a species which had not even a fraction of semblance to itself, simply came to mourn it. It did not attack me. It just mourned. I remembered I had had a brother once. I remembered that once we had had dictators, that we had once been simple, that we had once had ambitions of self, not whole. Then we had been guided. We had not been allowed. I both understood, and no longer understood why my kin had been deemed defective before he had even been given a chance to fully come into existence. I had a vision in my mind of a hand reaching out to me, an adult that should have instead existed in a state of minuscule sentience as a frail mass. They were unmade, as I had unmade many. I counted each and every one. I pulled them into a greater, some in my mind, then divided it into individual parts. Then I determined which had been unmade by my own hands. I wondered why I felt so little. It was faint. An overwhelming sense of sorrow, guilt, anger, and shame condensed into a tiny point of memory in my consciousness. My people are not what you would call a hive mind. We are simply a whole of individuals, all molded towards a single purpose. I believe many of us would still choose this path if we were allowed choice. I believe many of us would break if we understood we ever could have had a choice. There are those who I had viewed as broken, sick, unrecoverable traitors. Someone had taught them free will, largely by force. I think I am almost unique. I believe that, in the span of my people's history, ever since becoming no longer our own, you could count those of us who chose to be free in less than tens. I made my first choice. Rather, I made my first choice that I fully understood I was making in 537 years. I have killed, or at least aided in killing, 29,370, 896,431 sapient individuals, and 137 developed or developing civilizations. That is only in the context of my own lifespan and involvement, and I do not think these numbers will mean anything to you. But I think, in spite of this, you will understand that these numbers are not ones that are meant to climb higher. They will, I have no doubt. But I choose to have hope that perhaps one day the count will tick far slower. Maybe it will even stop eventually. I do not ask forgiveness. I was never here to be forgiven in the first place. I was not an individual, not one that was so in more than name. I had a title, culture, faith, and personality, yet every action I took was at the behest of another. I do not know at what point you started to alter and repurpose me, what parts of it were your hand and what parts were mine. But I take satisfaction that some part of it was me, and that you came to show me I had input. We will attempt to remove you as we did so many others. I will likely be considered a sign of significant deterioration. I do not know if they will heed me as something to suppress or something to consider, but I know that they will not be able to hide me. A voice must speak before it can be silenced. I hope that perhaps hearing mine will cause them to consider theirs. I ask you not to worry about war coming to your worlds. We will try. But we will also be distracted again onto more significant matters than humanity. We will change or we will be destroyed. There is something you failed to teach me. I still have not come to comprehend the diverting of blame and responsibility. You reminded me of more important things: squabbling, illogical action, and healing. I will gladly open the wound. We were, after all, made to cull that which is not needed. Only a handful of years after the Great Exhaustion, during the most turbulent period in the history of the viable systems since recent memory, roughly 100,000 humans and relevant interspecies crew were captured by a species that had previously identified itself as the Grecs in humanity's early years as a present force in the greater settled galaxy. After commencing and ceasing hostility, with little apparent reason, they were believed to have lost interest in the settled systems and retreated to a perceived dark space. The full light of the Grek species dynamic with the rest of the known galaxy has since become plain. A species that was uplifted by a powerful sub-entity of the vehemence native to the resentment, a section of known space imbued heavily with feelings of empathic loathing, they have taken on a role of self-perceived dictators of what is and is not considered worthwhile life within the bounds of the universe. Having long been at war with a second species known as the Cog, they have largely existed at the edges of the galaxy and mainly been known as vague historical assailants. Initial study of Grek's activity led to the belief that they were a fully cognizant species that had, in some manner, been indoctrinated completely on an empathic and neurological level despite retaining full individuality. Humanity, and those other species less aware of their presence existing within the viable systems, were horrified by the concept of a species fully capable of independent thought, yet also utterly without true free will and choice. They were relieved to discover this to not be fully factual. Shortly after what was assumed to be a Grek's general sent an unprompted, unencrypted signal containing the above audio and text to human settled space, a series of brief attacks were conducted by the Grek species against the settled systems with a bias towards human-touched worlds. Hostilities have since been redirected towards the Cog and the Grek species itself. A full common generation after it was determined that a state of intersystem emergency was no longer necessary, a craft of significant size was detected heading towards a major multi-species paradise world. Its hull was near impossible to breach. Upon arrival, the vessel opened its own ports automatically. Within the vessel were discovered immense archives, which have been estimated to have such significant volumes of text, audio, and visual data that they would take centuries to parse, in a significant manner. This was in tandem with a previously undiscovered pair of species that appear to have a symbiotic nature. These tree-like and insectile life forms have since been recognized as an underdeveloped but fully intelligent co-civilization and adopted into the greater galactic fold as endangered peoples. Understanding the complex systems of the vessel has proven difficult, as well as the volume of different languages and communication methods contained within. Massive vaults of what appear to be culturally significant items to unknown life forms have been discovered inside. It is believed that the number of dead languages involved exceeds the volume, in excess, of those known across all failed and successful civilizations found across the viable systems. The entire vessel, after a decade of study, was finally understood to have been stripped of all weapon systems beyond those dedicated to defense. The life support system has been determined to be capable of, theoretically, supporting multiple full civilizations for an unknown but lengthy period of time. The ship has been dubbed Morgan's Ark. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.